Peace. Welcome to One Black Perch Publishing Channel, a space for writers where I share my thoughts and takeaways from books that I've come across on writing, editing, publishing, topics on creativity, and sometimes books on the Black radical tradition that I've recently picked up. But today I wanted to share what's become one of my favorite books on writing recently, when I read an anthology of writing advice by Black authors and poets titled How We Do It. I came across Carl Phillips' essay on syntax and thought it was helpful, so I decided to check out one of his books on writing, which turned out to be useful too. I also bought a book on syntax, but this is his book, My Trade is Mystery, 7 Meditations from a Life in Writing by Carl Phillips. He's a Pulitzer Prize winning poet, teacher for over 40 years, and a mentor for emerging writers, and he wrote this as advice to his students and mentees. 7 essays, he talks about the importance of these 7 different elements that he considers important or essential for your writing journey. So there's like ambition, stamina, silence, community, and a few others. But there's a lot of tools available for aspiring authors today. You can make newsletters, blog posts, social media content. Now you can even prompt all of those things too, but none of it actually makes writing success any easier to reach. So his exploration of these elements in this book is pretty short read, still relevant, at least for the time being. So if you're going to make a commitment to something, it helps to define what your ambitions are concerning it beforehand, or at least during the process at some point. He defines ambition as a steady drive without expectation, and offers a warning about ambition in the form of desiring approval and desiring being valued and feeling loved through your writing career. And it being a slippery slope that he said he's actually fallen into before, and it's sort of based on distorted logic that if I'm published in a magazine, or I'll be a real writer, or from there it becomes addictive about winning a prize or getting a particular fellowship, or being published in a certain anthology by a certain press. He says that prizes and awards are like flies that follow horses. That's the analogy he uses. So they're just sort of a distraction. They're just going to be there whether you're comfortable with them or not. So just think about how much awards and recognition and acknowledgement matters to you. Gauge yourself now, whether you kind of gird yourself for whatever may come along the way. But just don't let them distract you from your primary purpose of getting the words out that you need to get out. He mentions that he never intended to have a career as a poet, but when his work began getting accepted to journals who published the work of poets he admired, he fell down that slippery slope of seeking approval and comparison. So it may be good to think about what will keep you energized to write, even if you don't gain the approval or recognition from a particular crowd or certain people or a certain person, or if you're not compared to someone that you're inspired by. Some people love to craft a story well, more than anything. The idea of working on the next story provides them enough energy to get them through. So whatever happens after it's written is out of their control, and they're just entirely okay with that because they're free to take on the next idea. It may or may not reach the number of people that they want, or get a ton of sales, win the awards, get reshared, or any of that. But just having it done well is really what matters most to them, even though getting all of those other things would of course be welcome. Kind of idealistic, detached in what might be called a healthy way. But Phillips says that writing poetry is like discovering the native language of his interior self. You see these kind of quotes by writers and poets that explain their own aspirational and grounded analogy for approaching your craft, and usually pretty helpful because they give you a standard of quality to look for when you're making an honest assessment about your work before you start revising it or during revision, which is separate from being good enough for magazines or consideration for awards. He later writes about things that the committed artist is driven by. One of them is finding another way of approaching the conundrums that have been the catalyst for making art all along. So, we write what we write for a reason, and to address our conundrums is very healthy and fulfilling and a noble way of engaging writing. We discovered a catalyst for our writing, how we summarize our days, recount conversations, describe a period of time in your life, or remember the climate during a particular election year, or the stories that continually show up in your work, in your writing. So the catalysts are likely all there. All you have to do is look at them for yourself after you write them. I write now really because I can't help it. I read a lot, so I feel the need to write more, like a waste management system for words. More than half the time it's enjoyable, even when writing about things that are difficult to talk about. But another essential element that he talks about is practice, which is unavoidable when it comes to writing. He shares how his writing ideas around practice have to evolve, and learn that the point of practice isn't for perfecting, which is an easy notion to misunderstand if you've played in bands early on in your life, like he said he had. I totally understand that too. I was a band kid, very young, so I get it. It's more so for the movement towards something rather than perfection. On a musical instrument, practice means routine of eliminating the likelihood of mistakes. But that's what people might call mastery of the instrument. But Phillips says he doesn't believe in mastery when it comes to art at all, mainly because your relationship to writing, it can and will change over time. So will language itself, making mastery an impossibility, and it makes fluency a more attractive motivation and realistic pursuit. He uses a quote from the poet Pamela Alexander as a way to tell if you're getting better or becoming more fluent in your writing. She wrote that finally we forget what we are carrying and do not make mistakes. So the idea being, if you write daily, it'll eventually become routine, and then you'll forget that you're writing and become more in tune with what you're writing. That's how he read Alexander's forgetting what we carry. It almost sounds like experiencing flow, which is another great book for creatives, or a self-development book too. But addressing the second part of her statement, do not make mistakes, he says that because the goal is fluency instead of mastery and production, you only make mistakes when you're overly aware of what you're doing. But in terms of what you should write daily, that's depending on what your goals are, where you are in your writing career. But if you're just starting, he suggests journaling, which I mentioned a couple of times before. And a lot of other authors co-sign. You just write your thoughts as they come to you in the moment, every day, for an hour, undistracted, preferably uninterrupted. The idea being that you'll eventually write as fluidly as you think. And you might discover something during the process, because we don't often know what we're going to say or we think about something until we've said it, once we've gotten it out. And that's one of the ways that we get to learn about ourselves through writing, one of the many benefits of journaling. He also spoke to a trend that he saw in his younger students viewing writing as a practice, and the conversation around that having much to do with details like what time of day and why, for how long and why. Do you have a routine to prepare? Do you set a mood of any kind? What do you need? Do you need green tea with honey and lemon? Do you have affirmations or quotes on hand? Do you use guideposts, that kind of thing? A lot of things that are actually dependent on who you are, what you need, what your preferences are, what your life will allow, what you might be willing to sacrifice. But another thing to add to your writing practice that he mentions is being receptive, not just observant. He calls it listening to life, allowing yourself to listen to the world around you and stay open, experience life as it is, and journal about your experience as you reflect on it later. His essay on stamina focuses on the different kinds of stamina involved in a life of writing. That's a stamina that's generated from a sense of urgency that we can build a reserve of, useful for taking initiative. There's a stamina involved in reviewing your work, for instance, and disappointed in the quality of it, or continuing to move forward without apprehension. The more you move forward, the more of a reserve you build of that kind of stamina too. So something like a resilience. Another kind of stamina he mentions is how you maintain youthful urgency without being in the midst of urgent personal crisis. The kind that allows words to flow continually, no matter what happens to be going on. It doesn't necessarily have to be turmoil all the time. It conjures up a lot of words. You can just sit down and practice writing. But not all writing is born out of crisis or is about crisis, but you should feel that what you're doing is urgent no matter what you're writing about. And he offers that resistance is necessary too to build that urgency too. So it builds stamina sort of in an indirect way. So what are the things that you're against? What, either as forces or phenomena in the world, or within the more intimate interior space of being a human being. Somewhere among those things is something urgent, something that can generate and build the necessary stamina that you'll need to keep going. Again, this is why it helps to remain curious and read about the things that matter to you. So there'll always be something there for you to feel the need to say something about. speak on, to be heard on. As long as you know how to directly trigger your need to express, you can build your stamina. The thing about putting the reception of his work into perspective and to sustain stamina, Phillips will remind himself that before anyone else read the book, he felt the need to write it, and that it meant something to him before he read any reviews of it, and it'll be true of the next book that he writes too, no matter what the reception is. The same thing is true for you. So if it matters to you, write it, deal with whatever audience is there or not later. We'd also say that the last book he wrote was a necessary step for him to create the next one, to work on the next one. So no matter what the reception is, you also stay grateful for having written the book, for its value as a building block or another milestone in your writing practice. So now the question is, if you haven't written your first book, but yet intend to, can you stay grateful for having written a few pages of a draft every day for months, aware that in the final draft, only 60 or 70% of the words from your first draft might survive? Subscribe for more books on writing, editing, publishing, and creativity.